So the first thing we're going to talk about are ancient civilizations, and we're going to talk about how their treatment of women and how they looked at women's role in recreational habits essentially created the institutionalized idea and how we still think about, to some degree, what is proper for women to do physically and athletically, and what is not so comfortable for us to see or witness or accept or support. Now, it is certainly untrue that women are limited in being able to do kind of and pursue whatever they want. However, it still is very common for people to not be able to accept that women are considered serious athletes. Just one look at a positive post about a female athlete and the comment section below by the peanut gallery will clearly indicate to you that there are a lot of people out there that still think that women belong in the kitchen making sandwiches and not playing sports, and showing that they can actually do physical things very well. So it's really, you may not know anybody like that. You may not come in contact with people that think that way, but people like that are out there. They are out there, and they're out there in larger numbers than we would like to probably believe or admit. So this is why we have to continue to tell the stories and talk about why, even if women's professional basketball is different from men's professional basketball, it doesn't mean that it isn't good. Different doesn't mean worse. Different just means it's different, and that we can still appreciate what those women do well, and how crafty they are and how skilled they are at their sport, at their game. So let's start with ancient civilizations. We're going to talk specifically about three ancient civilizations: the Egyptians, the Greeks, and the Romans. We're going to look at and talk about the roles and the treatment of these women in these societies, their actual athletic and recreational habits by these women, and then we're going to talk about and identify a few notable women in some of these different societies. And so these are people that you're going to want to make sure that you're aware of, and you know who they are, why they're important. So just for a couple of contextual things, when we talk about ancient times, especially for those of you that maybe aren't big into history, when we speak about the ancient era, we're talking about 3500 before the Common Era, so BCE, to about 476 in the Common Era, or CE. So 3500 BCE to 476 CE, which is the fall of the Roman Empire. And that is considered the ancient era, the ancient times. When we say ancient civilizations, we're talking about that time frame between 3500 BCE and 476 CE. And we talk about, we look to the Egyptians, the Greeks, and the Romans because as civilizations, as cultures, they were incredible. They were incredible mathematicians, they were incredible scientists, architects, they had very sophisticated government structures. They were the model for many things that we, in our own sort of developed cultures and societies, modeled after. And so, of course, many things that they did, we sort of can find a link to, and how it developed and what has sustained or has shifted and changed accordingly in our culture. So that's sort of a little bit of a contextual, some contextual reasons behind why we look at the Romans, the Egyptians, and the Greeks, and the time frame that we are talking about when we're looking at these cultures in the ancient era. So the Egyptians, an incredible society that were, really lived their life around the Nile River. They were amazing with quarrying, surveying, and construction techniques that helped facilitate some of those monumental structures they built in the pyramids, and then of course temples and obelisks. These are all things that the Egyptians were able to manufacture and create in the ancient time. In the ancient civilization, they had a pretty sophisticated system of mathematics, a pretty practical and effective system of medicine, irrigation system, agricultural production techniques. So, they were certainly certainly left a lasting legacy in a lot of those realms, but also in art and architecture, where we see widely copied forms of what they did in future artistic forms through the Roman and Greek empires and through all of Europe, and then, of course, going west and east, both directions. So I think we recognize in the Egyptians that they, when we look at their society and we study their society, we recognize that they really enjoyed a wide variety of leisure activities, including sort of dancing and games, music. They played a game called Senate. On the PowerPoint, you see an image of a couple of women with some hieroglyphics, as a backdrop, and they're sitting at a table that looks like a chess table or like a checkerboard. That's actually a game called Senate, and it's kind of it's, you would think it's probably like chess or checkers, and it's maybe likens that, but it's really, the movements are actually more random, and a little bit of like by chance they move around the board. But it was a game that was very common and popular, and 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 so there was just a wide variety of sort of leisurely activities that Egyptians really enjoyed taking advantage of. And of course, because they lived their life around the water, they certainly also loved to do things like boating, swimming. They loved anything that had to do with like the sort of elements of water. And then they also did things like, ball games, juggling, hoop and stick. There's some pictures of that in there. And wrestling was a big thing also that we know was very common in Egyptian society because it was documented through images that were found at the tomb of Beni Hassan, which is pretty much one of the most sort of important pieces of artifacts that historians look at to understand the culture of the Egyptians during the ancient times or ancient society. They also enjoyed hunting, and they enjoyed, again, boating and rowing. And if you were from a more wealthy sort of part of society, then you really got to take advantage of a lot of opportunities to boat. That was something that a lot of sort of the more wealthier families were able to do. So there was a sort of a wide variety of leisure activities that Egyptians did, and women participated in a good majority of them. They didn't tend to do much of the hunting or fishing, but they certainly danced and they did the ball games. Not a whole lot of wrestling, but the other sort of like board games and those types of things they certainly participated in. And it's probably considered that the Egyptians treated their women better than most of other ancient civilizations. They believed that joy and happiness, it was legitimate goals in life, and they regarded the home as a place that was a major source of delight. So if the women were happy, that means the home was happy, the women were joyous, and fulfilled, then the house was going to be that way. And so that was very important that the women were happy and doing what made them happy. And so it was tended to, we do tend to believe that women in Egyptian cultures were treated better, maybe a little bit more equally. But again, they didn't do a lot of the physical exertion activities like the wrestling and the hunting and fishing. But certainly they did the dancing and the ball games and swimming, those types of activities. And if they came from a wealthier family, then they did a lot of the boating and sort of other activities that more wealthier families were able to enjoy. One really cool piece of like sport history that we can trace back to the Egyptians is the invention of the game of bowling. And there is a slide that shows you what was discovered that we can tell is sort of that those beginnings of the development of the game of bowling. There's sort of these limestone panels that were put together to create the lane, and then there's two balls that are sitting on those panels of limestone. and it didn't originally have pins that you rolled to hit, but it was more about the two balls, the one smaller ball and the larger ball, and the goal was for the person that was rolling the bigger ball was to hit and move out of the way of the path the smaller ball. So it wasn't so much the pins initially, that came later, but it was the balls, the two different size balls, and trying to knock the one ball off of the path or off of the course. And so there's some other images there on that PowerPoint that show you clear depictions of Egyptians playing this sport of bowling, and then some women also playing, so we know that they participated in that as well. We do also know that the Egyptians were really sort of huge supporters of health, like health and strength, courage and toughness. We really do sort of look to the fact that they had female leaders in Hatshepsut and Cleopatra. That's really something that we know that was played a big role in how women were revered, and that their health and wellness was an important part of their living. So it was really, we know from sort of the model of the sculptures of the human form that we see that they really did value strength and fitness. But we also do see on the slide that shows the image of Hatshepsut on the right, and then on the left side it shows the female and male. We do still see that the female does sit slightly behind the male, and that the male is in a very powerful stance, and the female is in sort of a very supportive stance behind him, slightly behind him. But we do see that both of them have very sort of what we would consider fit and athletic body types, and so we know that that was important to them in their society, is that they had healthy bodies, and of course which created healthy mind, which made people happy, and which made your homes happy. So it's sort of how it all linked together and rolled together. So moving on to the Greeks, the Greek civilization, they thought a little bit more about men and women having pretty distinct roles, that they weren't meant to compete in any way, shape, or form. So Greeks did not see women as a part of as a part of an air of competition. We're going to talk a little bit here in a moment about the ancient Olympic Games, but any kind of festival that had any kind of like activity, physical activity around it, women were not welcome to be a part of that, even as spectators. It just wasn't something that was not valued or seemed right. And men took part in lots of physical activities, and they did a lot of these activities that sort of had to do with like coming of age, and women, like rites of passage, and women just didn't participate in those kinds of things. And so it was definitely a different type of society and how they treated their women versus how we have come to understand how the Egyptians treated their women. So what we did see that was popular for women in the Greek society were ball games. Again, kind of similar to what we saw in Egypt. Any kind, sort of these different wide variety of ball games, all different size balls, different number of people participating, different goals within those different games. We're going to talk about a few of them in a moment, but just any kind of sort of like, it's very leisurely, recreational activity with a ball, sort of playing back and forth with a few people or up to, sort of a group of people. Swimming was pretty popular for the Greek women as well, running and walking, and then, believe it or not, chariot racing. And there's one particular special chariot racer that you should know about, and then we're going to talk a little bit more about in a moment. But before we talk about some of the prominent things that women did in Greek society, which was counter to what the culture really sort of was comfortable with, we want to talk a little bit about the story of Atalanta. Atalanta is a mythological story about a woman who was born to her father, and he really wanted a son. So he was really upset when Atalanta was born as a girl, and so he actually sort of like cast her off to go live in essentially on a mountain top, and he was kind of figuring like she'll probably die there because she's not going to have any kind of resources to live, and he was okay with that because he wanted it to be a son. But what essentially happened was that she was cared for by bears, and she was raised to be tough, and hunters ended up finding her and then continuing to raise her, so she learned how to fight and how to hunt, and she learned how to do that sort of with kind of more of an animalistic instinct, but then learned how once the hunters had found her, learned how to do that sort of a practical sense as a human. And then later, she was actually reunited with her father. But having, sort of grown up in the wilderness, she was actually pretty happy. She was very free. She became a fierce hunter. She became very independent. And so she sort of took this oath of virginity to the goddess Artemis. And what happened was that she had two suitors essentially that tried to sort of provoke her, not really provoke her, tried to lure her, and she was so upset with them that she actually killed them. So two suitors that came her direction, and she was like, I'll have nothing to do. I'll have nothing to do with that. Well, when she was sort of reunited with her father was like, okay, well, and now that you're here and you are my daughter, you need to wed, you need to be married, you need to get married. But she wasn't interested. She was not interested in marriage. She was independent. She was she was a woman of her own right and own power, and so she did not want to get married, but her father wanted her to be married, and so she made a sort of agreement. She was sort of a la Brave, the animated film Brave. She said, if any if any man can beat me in a foot race, I will marry him. He will be the one for me. So sure enough, men were trying to beat her in a foot race. They couldn't beat her. She was, incredibly fast and skilled. So she was finding that there was no one that could sort of match her ability. Well, Melanian came along, and with the help of Aphrodite, was able to trick Atalanta essentially. So what Aphrodite created was three golden apples and shiny objects that when they were on the foot race towards the end line, the golden apples were thrown out in the path and sort of in front of Atalanta, and she sort of was, pulled away and enticed by them, and because of that, and she was distracted by them, Melanian was able to beat her in the foot race. He crossed the finish line before she did, and essentially she had to marry him because of that. And so there's a lot going on in this story. There's a lot of sort of dual messages being created. And so one of the reasons I like to share this story is because it creates confusion on how we should look at women. Because Atalanta, number one, wasn't wanted by her father, so she was essentially left to die. Well, she persevered, and in a big way. She was a really strong, independent woman, and learned how to live on her own, and wanted to make her own decisions. Well, so when her father then was reunited with her and said, you need to marry, she didn't want to do it, but he said, you have to, and she said, well, only if someone can beat me. And so we get this image and this sort of symbolism of strength and power and independence, autonomy by this woman, and yet we still come to see the message of she'll never though she'll never really be more powerful than the man, because in the end a man's going to either figure out how to overcome her physically, or he's going to be able to figure out how to trick her. And so we sort of, in the end, get this image of a woman who appears to be strong and independent and free thinking, but can just as easily be distracted by the shiny object, the golden baubles, as any other woman could, and the male will end up winning. And so the story has conflicting, messages, because it's trying to tell a story of a strong female figure, but in the end she is, she's beaten and defeated, really through trickery. And so then she kind of appears weak and unable to sort of hold her own. And so the story is important because it gives us this mixed signals of the ability of women and the strength and the power of women and the independence of women. And so so what that does is it continues to support the narrative that the man in the end always has the last say, is always going to make sort of the last call on things. So there are instances in the Greek culture where we do have clear sort of artifacts that show women did have some places where they could go and they could carry out sort of these physical activities. In the Athenian culture, there is there are artifacts there that have been some architectural grounds that have been excavated, and they have discovered the sanctuary to Artemis, which is where sort of wrestling and running activities were it took place, and there is sort of evidence that women were a part of that, and so we do know that exists. And then we are very fully aware of the Spartan culture, the women from Sparta, who were really highly valued in their little part of the Greek culture. There is probably an instance where women were probably treated and regarded in the highest way, compared to any other ancient society, including Egyptian society, because what was really important to the Spartan culture was raising strong men, and in order to raise strong men, they need to be born as strong boys. In order to be born as strong boys, the woman needed to be strong that was carrying them. So it was an important part of their culture that the woman was educated, she was smart, she was knowledgeable, intelligent, that she was athletically capable, she was strong, she was flexible, she had endurance, that she was able to manage on her own, she was able to horseback ride, manage a bow and arrow, she weightlifted, she ran, all of those things that provided her the opportunity to be strong, and strong and smart, and capable women was important in the Spartan culture. And so we see here is an instance where we do see that women were valued, the strength and the health of women was valued, because they were able to then raise strong and healthy men, which was a very important, it was very important to their society. These women were taught to read, they were taught to write, they were trained in all different types of athletic endeavors, from gymnastics to horseback riding, like I said. And then they were also trained and were able to participate in chariot horse racing, which was also before this time pretty much a male activity. And there's one really important chariot racer whose name is Siniska, or Kaniska. And she actually became the first Olympic champion. She was a chariot trainer, racer, and she is the only known documented woman to participate in the ancient Olympic Games, because the ancient Olympic Games were not open to women, whether that was participation or spectatorship. Women weren't allowed. But Siniska, the reason she was allowed to chariot races because she trained the chariot racers and the horses, but the actual rider when it came to the Olympic participation was a male, were men. And so because she was the trainer, she is considered the Olympic champion, because that was who was considered the champion, as opposed to the male rider who actually competed in the race at the time. So Siniska became sort of she was a Spartan. She was from the Spartan culture. She was sort of considered a Spartan princess, and was really kind of looked at as a symbol of the rise of the female, like the rise of woman power, because she was a woman who, despite all the obstacles presented in front of her, was able to find a way to become an Olympic champion at a time when women had nothing to do with the Olympic Games. So she's a really important person to know because she did indeed prove the capabilities of women at that time when they weren't really welcome or allowed to be a part of athletic competition. So, speaking of Olympic competition, and continuing talking about the Greeks, we have to talk about the games of Hera, the Herarian games, because this is what the Greek women did in lieu of being able to participate in the Olympics, is that they competed in the games of Hera, or the Herarian Games. These were held in the honor. The Herarian Games were held in honor of the Greek goddess Hera, and it was again separate from the Olympic Games because it was only for women, and because women couldn't participate in the ancient Olympic Games. But like the Olympics, it was held in 4-year intervals. It was organized by 16 married women who were peacemakers from Pisa and Elis in Italy, and they, because of their political competence, became sort of administrators of the Herarian Games. And so what they wanted to do was create this opportunity every 4 years for women to come and to compete. And they prepared these games for mating competitors, and they had to be virgins, and they were split into 3 different, essentially, age groups, and they only competed in foot races. That was it. Then the foot race was a sixth of the length of the men's typical race that was held in the Olympic Games, and so they did just compete in foot races, but it still wasn't even to the extent of what the men did, comparatively, in the Olympic Games. The women wore chitons, and this is where the dress comes over one shoulder and one bare breast is exposed. There's actually an image of it in the PowerPoint slideshow that you can see, a replica of a statue that was created of a woman who would have competed in the Herarian Games. And it's attributed to about 520 to 500 BCE, so you can take a look at that. But anyway, the Herarian Games didn't have the prestige of the Olympic Games as like the men did, but the Greeks still considered them a serious athletic event. It was looked to be quite an honor to, number one, even compete at the Herarian Games, but two, if you became a winner, because the victors were really treated quite well. They were given sort of crowns of olive branches. They were given statues in honor of them and their likeness, and they were given part of a sacrificial cow, which is what was always done in honor of the Greek goddess Hera. So it was considered a very serious event, and it was definitely considered something to as a privilege to be a part of. So to kind of recap, Greek women, ball games, swimming, there's sort of this, these stories of stronger women, especially when we think about the Spartan culture. But it's really important to think about the Herarian Games, to remember Siniska, to remember the story of Atalanta. But it's also important to remember, like, they still weren't able to participate in the Olympics. You notice that the things that they did do aren't really overly taxing activities. They weren't allowed spectatorship at the Olympics, and certainly any activities they did didn't create crowds of spectators. It was really, just a part of like their common everyday activities. And a lot of the stories have been buried, or they're just untold. So this is why we're trying to tell them now. And so let's segue into another story of what may be sort of originated in Greek mythology, which is the story of the Amazons. This is another important story to be told because, much like Atalanta, this is a story of women who are strong, independent, and essentially can show and prove that they can exist on their own as a society of their own without men there. Um, Amazon is a word that comes from the word amos, which is without breast, and so what they did was they would cut off or burn off their right breast, which made it easier for them to use their bow and arrows, which of course is what they used to hunt. And so these women were these strong societies of only women. They only, used men to get pregnant so that they could bear children. If they had male children, they would sort of release them into the wild or into another culture or society nearby and allow them to be raised in that environment. But really, they just wanted to be a society of fierce women warriors. And so this is an important group of women to know about and to understand their presence, because they are essentially early symbols of feminism. Strong, independent women who are able to manage themselves, don't need the male counterpart to help them function in society. And this image of the Amazon woman has been reused over again in pop culture. Certainly, if you are a fan of Wonder Woman, and I know there's been a resurgence of Wonder Woman with the movie that came out a little while ago. If you look at her character, she certainly is sort of in the or the image of an Amazonian woman. Xena the Warrior Princess, which was a really popular show in the late 90s, she also very much looks like what we would think of as a typical like Amazon warrior princess. So these women are clearly hearkening to a time where, or to a society of women that we know were strong and really fierce women that are a clear symbol of sort of female power and ability and capability. So the last society that we're going to talk about are the Romans. And we'll talk about how the Romans were treated differently from the Greek women and the Egyptian women. Women in Roman culture were always under the guardianship of a man. So it could have been a husband, their father, it could have been a brother, it could have been a uncle, but it had to be someone in their family that was a male that was sort of essentially their guardian. And so they didn't have much freedom. They didn't have much choice to do what they wanted to do when they wanted to do it. They weren't revered or sort of felt to be and sort of taken seriously when it would come to any kind of physical activity, whether that was laborious or whether that was like in recreation or athletic. What was usually popular for women were different ball games, kind of like what we saw from Egyptian women and Greek women. And again, we're going to talk about some of these more specific ball games in a moment. Weightlifting, swimming, and other kind of like thermae activities, which is again centered around the water. I want to talk a little bit about some of the ball games that were pretty popular. And they were popular by women that were considered, or that what were called the bikini girls. The bikini girls are women that were identified through the artifacts that were found in some of these ancient sites that were discovered and analyzed. And these images of these women in bikinis, essentially, and you could tell they're doing some kind of physical activity. And in many of them, there is a sense that they're lifting weights, but in many others of them, there's a sense that they're doing these games with balls. And there's three particular ball games I think that are important to know about from the Roman culture. Harpastium is one, Trigon is the other, and Expulsum Ludere is the third. And they're on your PowerPoint, so you'll learn how to spell them, and you can see sort of the key characteristics of them. Harpastium was played with a hard, small ball. There was about 5 to 12 players in a rectangular field, sort of a little bit akin or similar to maybe today what we consider as American soccer. Trigon was another hard ball and was played with 3 players, so hence the tri in the word or in the name Trigon. They stood in a triangular formation. and they just passed the ball around, and they sort of kept expanding the distance, and the idea was to sort of challenge each other to get that ball to, go further and further um, without dropping the ball or bobbling the ball. And then explosive luderi was pretty much essentially what is today's present day handball. So, kind of like racquetball, but without a racket. You just use your hand to hit the ball within a small space, and you sort of play off of all the surfaces that are around you. Explosive luderi was very similar to a present day handball. So one other thing we should talk about is what was very popular in ancient Rome was gladiators, and gladiator fights. And as you probably could assume, your intuition's probably telling you like women probably weren't allowed to be gladiators, and that was fairly true until 63 before the Common Era, when Nero and Domitian and Severus, those sort of order of emperors were like, hey, women can gladiate. Why not? Let's get them out there. Well, they did get them out there. Female gladiators are known as gladiatrices, and they initially fought each other, so woman to woman, and then they fought dwarfs, and then eventually they did fight men. But it was women who essentially needed to do the fighting to improve their life, and so the women that won essentially received freedom for being skilled fighters and sort of freedom to live a little bit better. They were given gifts that were some that were like things that they needed, like necessities to live, and some of them were, like shields and medals and trophies that were, more like trinkets or awards for fighting, for skilled fighting. It wasn't a long period of time that women did gladiate. The gladiatrices basically stopped fighting about 200 in the Common Era, but we know for sure that female gladiators existed. And you read an article about some of the artifacts that have been found in archaeological digs of remains of female gladiators. Amazonia and Aquileia are two female gladiators that there's a stone carving of that was discovered. And that's obviously a clear documentation of those two women who fought each other in gladiator fights. So you can get a sense from the ancient cultures that they really did, in some cases, looked at women as an important part of their society, but it was always related to more of the domestic role, right? So even the Egyptians, who valued a happy home and that the woman was a part of that, that was really more in a domestic realm and a domestic thought. And what women did recreationally was very mellow, or low key. It wasn't very physically exertive. It certainly wasn't in a group setting. They're all like individual activities, and that certainly was clear in the Greek societies. And the fact that women had to create sort of their own Olympic version of games and the Herarian games, we know that they weren't looked at the same way that men were considered the same in the same realm as men were. And then we saw that also carry over in the Roman culture, where women were under the guardianship of a man, and a male in their family. And so we already understand the woman's place in these ancient societies and what their sort of role was when it came to physical activity. And it wasn't things that were the same as men. And it's maybe with the exception of the Spartan culture, right? We didn't really see these women doing things that were overly exertive and physical, and what we would maybe term as masculine activities. And that's why the stories of Atalanta and the story of the Amazon women are important stories. They're important stories to share, because they are stories of women who do have the physical capabilities to perform in a way that seems counterintuitive to what we think women can do. So those stories are important, that they carry forward and that they continue to be symbols of strength. And again, they sort of counteract what we think of as the typical woman's role in these ancient societies. But it's also important to know what the women did. The sort of running and swimming and dancing and ball games and those are the types of things that we want to make sure we know and realize that that's what these ancient societies had their females doing as part of their recreational habits and behaviors. So you'll want to, for next week, make sure that, well, number one, make sure you review your readings as you have, after you have listened to this lecture and looked again at the PowerPoint. And then for next week, make sure that you're reading about all the early precedents in American recreational habits. Excuse me. And then start working on your sport toying around assignment. It's a pretty fun assignment. It's pretty interesting, pretty eye-opening for most people. And then a reminder to you that on Monday your first publication review is due, and then I'm going to post some of the articles later in the week to create a discussion board on them. So make sure you pick a good one, because we'll want to pick some ones that are going to be really interesting to talk about. And then also there will be a link that's created for you on Moodle by Sunday for you to upload that weekly media review, and that will be the same every single week. I'll have a new link for you to put your new media review under each week, so don't put them all in the same link. Make sure you use the new link every week for your media review. And then again, I'll pick the sort of the best ones or most intriguing ones that I like, that I think will create some good discussion, and we'll have discussion boards on those in the latter part of each week after you've submitted those for the week. So if you have any questions about the media review, if you have any questions about the sport toying around assignment, please contact me, email me, message me. I want to make sure that you feel like you understand the assignment so that you can get the most out of it and enjoy the opportunity to do the assignments as I hope and intend for them to be experienced. If you have any questions about what I've lectured about here, make sure you reach out about that as well. If you want clarification on something, or if you're like, why did they do it that way, or why is that, or how do we know that, make sure you reach out to me. And again, I'll add some extra information there for you as needed. So I hope you enjoyed your first lecture, History of Women in Sport. I hope you've enjoyed the reading so far and learning about some ancient cultural habits and some things that we've discovered about women in the ancient cultures that's given us more clear indications about what they did. And I hope you look forward to next week's topic of early American precedents. Enjoy your weekend, and we'll see you next week. Bye.